All right, we are back with Eduardo Tapia, and we're going to be discussing some legal issues that have come up with regards to real estate purchases in Cabo. And the first question is you've mentioned, Eduardo, that there's been some recent mistakes that you've seen, especially in this market because it's so hot, where people, if you look at the States, people are just, they're like, hey, we don't need to do an inspection, things like that. But what are specifically within contract negotiations that you've seen with this hot market that, buyers or sellers are making in contract negotiations?
Yeah, certainly it's a good thing you point out it's a hot market because people, for lack of inventory, are willing to take unnecessary risks in my book. And not only in Los Cabos, I've seen this throughout Mexico. The good thing is that Mexico has more or less a uniform system of purchasing in place, even though civil law is local, and that would be the law pertaining to real estate transactions. The thing about Los Cabos is that people sometimes think of it as an extension to the U.S. And there's obviously some similarities as far as the language goes, because a lot of brokers are U.S., they're even licensed in the U.S. And then the other part is that the language is very commonplace in here in Mexico, in this part of Los Cabos, where English is almost like a first language. I've had people living here for 20 years and they do not know Spanish, which obviously is kind of funny, but they obviously have a community going, and there's a lot of places that people like to look into as far as investments. But not only second homes now, people are actually gearing towards a primary home possession in this area. So what happens is the scarcity of inventory then plays into two things. One is the purchase price. Obviously the purchase price is going up, and what you need then is a pre-sale pricing point, which does two things. One, obviously accommodates buyers to gather up the remaining portion of funds or secure financing for that purchase price, which is on the low side because the pre-sale is just that, right? The project is going to go underway. Eventually, what you need to do is, first off, check all the boxes that pertain to keeping leverage with the buyer. And the most common mistake I've seen is that when they approach me, they've already given out substantial amounts of money to the seller. And what that does is simply then has an uneven bargaining,
Gives them more power.
Ratio, yeah. And so instead of having those funds in escrow, which is what I would normally recommend, there is a deposit, right, that you need to show that you're a serious buyer. And I get it, developers want their money yesterday. They need the money to go out and build the project, so they need those pre-sales in place for that. The problem is that once the funds leave escrow and then are deposited with the seller, and they go hard, as they say in this type of scenario, then you have that unnecessary power given over to the seller, where you already committed to the sale, and there's really not even a brick laid on top of another brick. There's just basically drawings, there's certain plans, and construction has probably not even started. If they give you an outside completion date of a year and a half, that is probably 90% of the time never met. It is always this, that, and the other. There are pricing issues with steel, and after the pandemic, there's a lot of scarcity of inventory of raw materials and things that need to be imported in the process. And just simply, it's difficult for the builders themselves to actually say, okay, this is going to be your cost, right? So buyers are very eager to get their hands on what inventory there is there. The good thing of Los Cabos is that there's a lot of land, to go around, and the topography is such that you can actually get a pretty nice view because of the mountains towards the sea. It's not what you need to have, for example, in Cancun, where you basically, if everything's flat, Playa del Carmen, it's flat. So if you're not, first row, you're not going to see the water. You might see the water on a second story, on a second tier, but that's about it. Here in Los Cabos, you have a different story. So going back to that part of the common mistakes is saying, okay, if you need a deposit, we can have a refundable deposit into escrow saying, hey, I'm a serious buyer, but I just need to make my due diligence. I'm working with a couple of clients now that it's, let's say, an extreme example of what's going on. These clients have paid over $100,000 of pre-sale. They haven't gotten their units. They obviously haven't gotten possession. And when I approached the developer for our due diligence, they haven't been willing to give us any documents whatsoever. So we have to go to the property registry. We have to do an additional search for things that any seller would be or should be willing to say, well, this is my title. There are no liens or encumbrances on property. And I have had to request a formal meeting, which I did, for example, in this case last week. And I still haven't, I followed up yesterday, for example, and they haven't, given me anything. And they've already in there, and they've already requested additional funds. So the only thing we have to go on is you're not going to see an additional funds given to you until you give us documents that are reasonable. My request, as I told this particular person, is reasonable. What I'm asking is not something that is uncommon in the process. And I see that the construction is going on. I see that there are some deliveries, which is great. But I just can't have, as counsel, the word of, okay, take my word for it, we're good, right? And I don't know if there is a financing in place that there has to be a need for a blanket mortgage, and then it has to get canceled individually. I don't know if there's a condominium regime in place just yet. So there's a host of things that happen when clients are too easily pulling the trigger on a purchase. And so they should obviously come before this process happens, so that one obviously is word of mouth. There are certain developments that I tend to say to my clients, stay away from these guys. That they are not good news. And obviously you've seen in your experience on a very personal level what happens when you have an asset that what happens with funds, title, possession, and all these things.